Hello, this is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. You know, I've traveled up and down the Pacific coast, basically from Mexico on up to Alaska. And at one time, the British and the Spanish and the Russians explored that whole Pacific coast. And at different times, they claimed parts of it as their territory. And so I didn't realize the extent that the Russians had explored and developed some areas along our Pacific coast. It's a beautiful country up there. And did you ever hear what happened to the Russian king or the Tsar who sold all this beautiful country to the Americans? And did I ever tell you the time I met a Russian up in Alaska? One time I was at a local festival in one of the Alaskan communities. I got talking to this guy on the street. He could have been my brother. He had a bottle of vodka in his hand and claimed to be a Russian tourist. He also claimed his headgear was an authentic Russian hat. At first he was not interested in a trade for my Western cowboy hat, but as the vodka disappeared down his throat, the more inclined he seemed to be open to a trade. I rest my case. Even his matching red glasses were a perfect fit. I asked him, what was a Russian doing this far from home? And he said, this was my home at one time. Russia owned Alaska. As the Russians came down the coast from the north, they claimed the territory to be theirs at various places over the years. At one time, they even claimed they owned territory as far south as near San Francisco in California. Another time, they claimed it to be around the 50th or 51st parallel, which is in along the north end of Vancouver Island. Another time, they claimed their territory ran as far south as a deep inlet or fjord that was just north of present-day Prince Rupert, BC. And when it came time after the Americans had bought the Alaska from Russia, and they were negotiating the boundary line with Britain, the Americans used the old Russian argument that Alaska did extend to the old boundary line down around the 55th parallel of latitude. And there's a big, deep canal there called the Portland Canal. And that area was considered the end of the Russian Empire in North America. And therefore, like I say, the Americans claimed that same area. And that's why the Americans have the Russians to really thank for being able to extend the Alaska boundary so far south. This is the Portland Canal right here. It is a deep sea harbor, 150 kilometers. It comes inland, and it is Canada's most northerly ice-free port. And right across the other side of the inlet is the United States. In this picture, Canada would be on the left, and the USA would be the area to the right. Water from the Salmon Glacier nearby flow into the Portland Canal. And I tell you about some great tourist things in a video on Highway 37 in this same playlist. In this map, the white line represents the border between the U.S. and Canada along the south end of the Alaska Panhandle. And the Alaska community right there is Hyder, Alaska. And just across the creek is the community of Stewart, BC. And the Portland Canal, the middle of the canal is the official boundary line. And there's the Salmon Glacier on the Canadian side that we saw a little earlier, a picture of it. And the water flows from it down into the Portland Canal. The way you get to BC, to Stewart, BC, the road ends there. But you come on Highway 37 going north in British Columbia, up from the Yellowhead, the Prince Rupert area. You're going north and you come to the junction with 37A, and it's a half hour, and you're at the coast at Stewart, BC. There is still considerable evidence of the Russians being in Alaska. This is the little Russian church in Juneau. And when I was there last time, descendants of the Russian people still hold the church each Sunday in their little church. And this is the big wooden cathedral in Sitka today. It burned down earlier, but they rebuilt it and restored it, and it's a great tourist attraction. Just look at those two spots at the top of the steeple. Yes, sir, even the eagles like it. The Russians, the British, and the Spanish explored and competed along the Pacific coast. The white line represents the coastline, and the Russians were down the coast from the north early, and they claimed Alaska in the 1700s. They formed a settlement at Kodiak Island. Then they formed the fur trading company called the Russian-American Company, in which they mainly dealt with the sea otters and sold them to China and to Europe. They formed a capital. They called it New Archangel, later called Sitka, when the Americans eventually bought Alaska. And the Spanish were coming from the south, northward, and the British as well. Captain Cook explored and mapped the Pacific coast in 1778. And Vancouver explored the British Columbia coast today that's there. And the Spanish headed north. They were 1776. They formed a colony at San Francisco. And much of their mapping indicates a Spanish origin in exploration along the coast. The Strait of Juan de Fuca is Spanish. Galiano Island, the tourist town today, Tofino, is Spanish in origin in its name. The same with Quadra Island and Port Alberni, the city in the center part of the island. And further up the coast in Alaska, the Spanish also mapped and named communities that we know today, Valdez and Cordova. The British and Russians competed in the fur trade, particularly for sea otter pelts that brought big money from Europe and even bigger money from China. The thing about these early times, the countries, Russia, Britain, and Spain, explored the coastline. And that's it. They were explorers. They did not bring settlement and large groups of colonies. Old Russian artifacts can still be seen occasionally, like this old Russian wooden Julian calendar that was modernized after World War I. Pegs were inserted into the holes for each day. Russian names can still be found on old cemetery plaques. The statue of Russia's Alexander Baranov, governor of Alaska, who developed the fur trade and established a few outpost communities during his 30-year head of the Russian-American Company. And it was a company not unlike the Canada's Hudson Bay Company. Both companies were intended to establish the mother country in the New World. Baranov mistreated the indigenous Tlingit people, who eventually revolted and killed or captured every Russian intruder. Baranov fled, but he returned with military reinforcements and drove out the Tlingit. This is a typical Russian dormitory house still standing, and you can see other evidences of the Russian era in the town. Baranov was unable to stop the continual selling of guns by the British and Americans to the Clinket. And eventually, Russia tried to gain the support of Spain, who was also exploring the unclaimed Pacific coast. The Russians also had a problem of adequate supplies into their settlements. They needed food, they needed machinery, and so a Russian by the name of Nikolai Rezanov went all the way down to the San Francisco, to California, to negotiate with the Spanish to get some supplies and search for a place for where they could grow things like garden vegetables and food like that. So he went down there and he negotiated with the Spanish. But the only thing is, love and politics got mixed up, and generally that's a bad combination. Nikolai Rezanov fell in love with the Spanish governor's daughter in California. The governor's daughter's name was Conchita, and Conchita agreed to marry Rezanov. But she needed permission from the Pope, way over in Rome. So the marriage was delayed. And in the meantime, Rezanov agreed to go home, buy a beautiful big diamond ring, and return and marry her. While we look inside this little Russian church in Juneau, I'll tell you the rest of the story. On the way back to Russia, Rezanov fell ill, fell off his horse, and died. Conchita never remarried, but joined a convent in later years. So was it a tragic love story, or was it an attempted political expediency on Rezanov's part? It remains another one of those mysteries of history. At any rate, the ultimate result was that a Spanish-Russian alliance never occurred, and the British competition and threat remained, that later ended up with Russia becoming discouraged and eventually selling to the Americans. Look how far down the coast the Russians came, all the way to their establishment of a farm and ranch at Fort Ross, just a few miles north of San Francisco. This is a state park today, right along the coast. At Fort Ross, they established a farm and ranch. And they manufactured boats and cut wood. Herds of sheep and cattle were raised. The soil was rich, the land was level. Grapes, cherries, peaches, pears, and cherries were grown. Wheat, beans, corn, and barley was also grown. These products were sent to various Russian communities all the way to Sitka. The local Indians were fairly treated by the Russians. There were good relationships. They often visited back and forth, celebrating various things together. There was music and dancing. Life was active and peaceful, and there was never any threat of an attack. The Russians built a chapel and intermarried with both the Indian and Spanish people. So in a nutshell, here was the situation. Russia feared Britain and Britain's interest on the Pacific coast. They therefore turned to Spain and tried to get an alliance with Spain. But as I told you in the story a minute ago, that did not work out. Now, Russia needed money, so the Tsar had spent a lot of money, and Russia was in debt. They needed money. They feared that they would maybe lose all of Alaska to Britain anyhow. So therefore, they knew that the U.S. was interested in Alaska. They eventually sold to the U.S. Russia had established 23 settlements in Alaska. But there was now less demand for sea otter pelts, and the distances were long, and Russia needed money. The extravagant living and wasting of money by the czars and the upper classes, combined with an expensive and disastrous war lost in the Crimea in the region of the Black Sea, and finally there was the sale of Alaska to the U.S. All of this over a decade or so created several years of dissatisfaction and unrest in Russia. Resentment toward the Tsar Alexander II, who agreed to the sale of Alaska to the U.S., was considerable, and there had been several attempts on his life. Finally, it happened. The Tsar rode in a bulletproof carriage back to his castle in St. Petersburg, Russia. The assassins were on the bridge when the carriage crossed the bridge. You can look at a few photos I took the last time I was in Skagway, Alaska, and I'll tell you the rest of the story about the Tsar who sold Alaska to the Americans. On that bridge, the signal was given by the woman, Sofia Perovskaya, when she blew her nose in her handkerchief. The first assassin knew it was time to throw the bomb under the carriage. The bomb severely shook the carriage, killed one of the escorts who was on horseback, and Alexander II was shaken up, and he staggered out of the carriage and shouted to the crowd, thank God, I am untouched. I am untouched." The second assassin shouted back to the Tsar, "It is too early to thank God." And he then threw the second bomb that killed the Tsar. There was a considerable resentment in Russia over the sale and loss of Alaska. In later years, Russia claimed it was only a temporary sale limited to a 99-year lease. However, the U.S. has insisted on the legality of a permanent sale and was quick to populate Alaska with two large cities, Anchorage and Fairbanks, and to establish a substantial military presence in Alaska. Nevertheless, in 1990, the Russians circulated some commemorative coins to mark a 200-year anniversary since the Russians first arrived on Alaskan shores. Maybe we haven't heard the last of the Russians in the far north country, and Canada had better get its act together if it thinks it has a right to claim any of those Arctic islands. I made a video on that and put it in this same playlist, so maybe you want to take a look at it. It's really thought-provoking. All right, until then, we're rolling on down the trail. This is I Go Travel with Don Barnett. So long for now. Hit the subscribe button and that'll tell you when we're putting more videos on the internet. To find more of my videos, just do what it says in the bottom. Google, start with the little @ at Don Barnett 5090. Click my name, hit the word playlists, and scroll down. Each playlist contains a number of travel videos.